The rising sun flag snapped violently in the Pacific wind as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. 6 months had passed since the stunning victory at Pearl Harbor, yet the architect of Japan's greatest naval triumph felt an inexplicable unease gnawing at his conscience. The December attack had crippled America's Pacific fleet, but like a wounded beast, the United States was stirring with dangerous fury. Yamamoto's piercing gaze swept across the vast expanse of ocean, knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, American forces were rebuilding, rearming, and thirsting for revenge. The admiral, who had studied at Harvard University, understood his enemy better than most of his contemporaries in the Imperial Navy. He knew that Japan's window of opportunity was rapidly closing, and decisive action was required to secure the Pacific Empire they had carved with blood and steel. In the cramped war room below deck, heated discussions erupted among the naval staff. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had helped orchestrate Pearl Harbor, spread nautical charts across the polished table. His finger traced potential targets across the Pacific, each location representing a strategic chess piece in the grand game of naval warfare. The officers debated various options. Should they strike at Australia, cutting the lifeline between America and its Pacific allies? Or perhaps target the Panama Canal, severing the vital link between the Atlantic and Pacific fleets? However, one target emerged with increasing prominence in their discussions: Midway atoll. This tiny speck of coral and sand, sitting alone in the vast Pacific approximately 1,000 miles north, west of Hawaii, represented far more than its modest appearance suggested. Midway served as America's westernmost outpost, a crucial refueling station and early warning system that could detect Japanese movements across the Central Pacific. The strategic importance of Midway was undeniable, yet it was the psychological value that truly captured the imagination of Japanese planners. By seizing this remote atoll, they could potentially draw the remaining American fleet into a decisive battle, where Japan's superior numbers and experience would prove overwhelming. The plan appeared flawless on paper: eliminate America's carrier force in one crushing blow, forcing President Franklin Roosevelt to negotiate a favorable peace that would secure Japan's Pacific conquests. As reports filtered in from intelligence sources, the Japanese admirals grew increasingly confident in their assessment. American morale appeared shattered following the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor. The Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, their industrial capacity, while impressive, would require months to replace the sunken battleships and damaged infrastructure. The timing seemed perfect for Japan to deliver the knockout punch that would end American resistance in the Pacific. Yet beneath this veneer of confidence, subtle warning signs began to emerge that would later prove catastrophic. Intelligence reports suggested that American codebreakers might have penetrated some Japanese communications, though the full extent of this breach remained unknown to Tokyo. Additionally, the April 18th Doolittle raid on Japan's home islands had demonstrated that American carriers possessed far greater reach and capability than previously estimated. The stage was now set for what would become one of the most pivotal naval battles in human history, a confrontation that would either secure Japanese dominance across the Pacific or mark the beginning of their empire's inexorable decline. Deep within the basement of Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, a team of American codebreakers worked tirelessly under the fluorescent lights, their eyes strained from countless hours of deciphering Japanese naval communications. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockford, the eccentric genius leading Station Hypo, paced between rows of desks covered with intercepted radio messages, mathematical calculations, and half-empty coffee cups that had grown cold hours earlier. The breakthrough came during the early hours of May 5, 1942, when Rockford's team successfully decoded a crucial Japanese transmission, mentioning an operation targeted at location AF. While the identity of AF remained mysterious, the frequency and urgency of these communications suggested something significant was brewing in the Japanese fleet. Rockford suspected that AF might be Midway, but he needed concrete proof to convince Admiral Chester Nimitz, the newly appointed commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. Meanwhile, aboard the carrier Akagi in Japanese home waters, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo reviewed the operational plans for what Tokyo had designated Operation Me. Nagumo, the veteran commander who had led the successful Pearl Harbor strike force, felt a mixture of pride and apprehension as he studied the complex battle plans. The operation called for a coordinated assault involving over 100 ships, including 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Japanese plan appeared masterful in its complexity. A diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention northward while the main striking force approached Midway from the northwest. Once the atoll was captured, the remaining American fleet would be forced to respond, allowing Japan's superior numbers to annihilate them in the decisive battle that had eluded them since the war began. However, critical flaws in the Japanese planning process were already beginning to manifest. The operation suffered from divided command structure, with Admiral Yamamoto directing overall strategy from his flagship while Admiral Nagumo commanded the carrier force and Admiral Nobute Kondo led the invasion fleet. This separation of command would prove problematic when rapid decisions became necessary during the heat of battle. According to records maintained by the Naval History and Heritage Command, Japanese intelligence gathering had become increasingly compromised by their own success. The rapid expansion across the Pacific had stretched their intelligence network thin, while overconfidence had led to reduced security measures in their communications protocols. American cryptanalysts were exploiting these weaknesses with growing effectiveness. Back in Hawaii, Rockford orchestrated a brilliant counterintelligence operation to confirm his suspicions about AF's identity. He arranged for Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting problems with their water purification system within hours. Japanese intelligence intercepted and reported that AF was experiencing water supply issues, conclusively proving that AF indeed referred to Midway Atoll. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Admiral Nimitz faced a monumental decision. The American Pacific Fleet had been severely weakened by previous losses, possessing only 3 operational aircraft carriers compared to Japan's 4. Enterprise and Hornet were available immediately, while Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor with significant battle damage from the recent Coral Sea engagement. Naval engineers estimated that proper repairs to Yorktown would require 3 months, time that Nimitz simply did not have. The American admiral made a characteristically bold decision that would alter the course of the war. Yorktown would be repaired in just 72 hours using emergency procedures, civilian workers around the clock, and temporary patches that might hold together long enough for one more battle. Every available pilot, mechanic, and support crew member was reassigned to prepare for what intelligence suggested would be the largest naval battle since Jutland in World War I. As both fleets prepared for their fateful encounter, the stage was set for a confrontation where superior intelligence and tactical flexibility would prove more decisive than raw firepower and numerical advantage. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, hung like a shroud over the Pacific as Admiral Nagumo's carrier force approached Midway from the northwest. The 4 Japanese carriers moved in precise formation, their flight decks bustling with activity as crews prepared the first wave of aircraft for the initial assault on Midway's installations. The morning air carried the acrid scent of aviation fuel and the metallic tang of ordnance. As bombers and fighters were positioned for launch, Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, studying reconnaissance reports that painted a reassuring picture of American defenses. Midway appeared lightly defended, with only a handful of aircraft visible on the atoll's makeshift runways. The admiral's confidence grew as he watched the methodical preparations below, where veteran aircrew who had participated in Pearl Harbor, the Dutch East Indies, and Ceylon campaigns readied themselves for another decisive victory. At precisely 4:30 in the morning, the first wave of 108 Japanese aircraft roared off the carrier decks, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed across the calm seas. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led this initial assault force, consisting of 36 Nakajima Cape bombers, 36 Aichi Valdive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Their mission was straightforward: destroy Midway's defensive capabilities and prepare the atoll for invasion. Unknown to Nagumo, American forces had been tracking his approach since the previous evening. Catalina flying boats had spotted the Japanese fleet approximately 700 miles from Midway, providing Admiral Nimitz with crucial advance warning. The American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown were positioned approximately 200 miles northeast of Midway, perfectly placed to launch their own surprise attack while Japanese aircraft were occupied with the initial assault. The Japanese strike on Midway began at 6:20 in the morning, with bombs and torpedoes raining down on the atoll's installations. Marine defenders, including pilots flying obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, fought desperately against overwhelming odds. Despite their valiant efforts, the Marines suffered devastating losses, with many of their aircraft shot down by the superior Zeros. However, Their sacrifice bought precious time and provided vital intelligence about Japanese capabilities and tactics, as reports from the Midway assault filtered back to Nagumo's flagship. Lieutenant Tomonaga's radio transmission delivered unwelcome news. A second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize the atoll's defenses. This recommendation created the first critical decision point that would ultimately seal Japan's fate. Nagumo had held back a second wave of aircraft, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically intended for attacking enemy ships. In case American naval forces appeared, the admiral faced a classic military dilemma. Should he rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack weapons for the second Midway strike, or maintain their current armament in case enemy ships were detected? His decision to rearm for a second land attack would prove catastrophically wrong, as it left his carriers vulnerable during the time-consuming process of switching weapons and refueling aircraft. At 7:28 in the morning, Japanese reconnaissance finally spotted American naval forces, including what appeared to be aircraft carriers. This sighting should have triggered immediate defensive measures, but the rearming process was already underway, creating chaos. On the carrier flight decks, aviation fuel lines snaked across the decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered about, and aircraft sat partially fueled and armed, a perfect recipe for disaster. Meanwhile, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were already approaching their targets, having launched their strike aircraft hours earlier based on the superior intelligence provided by Station Hypo. The trap that Admiral Nimitz had carefully constructed was about to snap shut. On the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the stage was set for a decisive confrontation that would demonstrate how superior intelligence and tactical flexibility could overcome numerical disadvantage in naval warfare. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the carrier decks where the fate of empires would soon be decided in a matter of minutes. The morning of June 4th transformed from routine to catastrophic in the span of heartbeats as American dive bombers plummeted from the sky toward the Japanese carrier force. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had spent precious fuel searching for the enemy fleet after flying to the originally reported position and finding empty ocean. His persistence in continuing the search, despite dwindling fuel reserves, was about to pay dividends that would alter the course of World War II. At approximately 10:24 in the morning, McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward and made the crucial decision to follow it. The destroyer was hurrying to rejoin Admiral Nagumo's main force, inadvertently leading the American strike force directly to their primary targets. As the Japanese carriers came into view, McCluskey could hardly believe his good fortune. Four of Japan's most powerful flat-tops sailed in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo was experiencing his own moment of crisis management. The returning aircraft from the Midway strike were circling overhead, many damaged and low on fuel, demanding immediate landing clearance. Simultaneously, his crews worked frantically to prepare the second strike force, switching weapons from ship attack to land attack armament. The flight decks had become congested nightmares of aviation fuel, bombs, torpedoes, and aircraft in various stages of preparation. The Admiral's tactical situation had become increasingly untenable. His returning Midway strike force needed to land immediately, but his flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed for the second strike. Meanwhile, reports of American naval forces somewhere in the vicinity demanded that he prepare for potential ship-to-ship combat. The complexity of managing these competing priorities in the heat of battle was overwhelming even his experienced staff. As documented in official U.S. Navy records, the American attack developed with devastating precision despite initial coordination problems. Torpedo squadrons from all three American carriers had attacked earlier with suicidal courage, but minimal success, drawing Japanese fighter cover down to sea level and leaving the high-altitude approaches clear. For the dive bombers, this unintentional coordination would prove decisive in the battle's outcome. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6 from Enterprise, selected Akagi as his primary target and pushed over into his dive at 14,000 feet. The dauntless dive bomber screamed downward at nearly vertical angles, its pilot fighting G-forces that threatened a blackout while maintaining precise aim at the enemy carrier. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi's flight deck near the aircraft elevators, penetrating into the hangar deck where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion aboard Akagi created a chain reaction of secondary blasts as aviation fuel ignited and ordnance detonated. Within minutes, The pride of the Japanese carrier fleet was transformed into a blazing inferno. Her flight deck buckled and twisted, her hangar deck filled with toxic smoke and raging fires. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara, watched in stunned disbelief as his flagship burned out of control. Simultaneously, Yorktown's dive bombers were attacking Soryu with equally devastating results. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led his squadron in coordinated attacks that placed multiple bombs on the carrier's flight deck and island structure, like a Kagi. Soryu's deck was crowded with fueled aircraft and loose ordnance, creating perfect conditions for catastrophic fires that soon consumed the entire vessel. The third victim of this decisive morning was Kaga, struck by multiple bombs from Enterprise's remaining dive bombers. The massive carrier, converted from a battleship hull, absorbed tremendous punishment but succumbed to the same lethal combination of aviation fuel fires and exploding ordnance that doomed her sister ships. Within 30 minutes, 3 of Japan's attacking carriers were burning wrecks, their experienced aircrew either dead or struggling in the oil-slicked waters of the Pacific. Only Hiryu remained operational from Admiral Nagumo's original striking force, and her captain, Tomio Kaku, was determined to strike back at the American fleet that had delivered such devastating punishment. To the Imperial Navy dock, Captain Tomio Kaku stood resolute on Hiryu's bridge as smoke from his 3 burning sister ships darkened the horizon, transforming the morning sky into an apocalyptic tableau of Japan's naval supremacy. Going up in flames, the veteran carrier captain, whose ship remained the sole operational Japanese flat top in the immediate battle area, faced a decision that would determine whether the Imperial Navy could salvage anything from this unfolding disaster. Kaku wasted no time in launching a retaliatory strike against the American fleet. At approximately 10:58 in the morning, 18 Aichi Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters roared off Hiryu's flight deck under the command of Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the American task force that had inflicted such devastating punishment on the mobile force, and every pilot understood that Japan's honor in the Pacific hung in the balance of their mission's success. The Japanese strike force navigated by following the smoke trails left by returning American aircraft, a grim irony that led them directly toward Admiral Fletcher's Task Force 17, Yorktown. The hastily repaired carrier that naval engineers had declared would require months of proper maintenance became the focal point of Japan's desperate counterattack. The carrier's temporary patches and emergency repairs, which had seemed miraculous just days earlier, were about to face their ultimate test under combat conditions. At approximately 12:11 in the afternoon, Kobayashi's dive bombers initiated their attack on Yorktown with the same precision and courage that had characterized Japanese naval aviation throughout the early war period. The first bomb struck near the island's structure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the lower compartments. The second bomb hit closer to the bow, starting fires among the aviation fuel systems and creating dense smoke that began to impair the carrier's operations. Despite suffering significant damage, Yorktown's crew demonstrated the damage control expertise that would become legendary in the American Navy. Chief Aviation Machinist Clarence Dickinson led firefighting efforts while engineering crews worked to maintain power and steering control. Within an hour, the fires were largely contained. Temporary repairs were in progress, and the carrier was maintaining formation speed with the task force. Admiral Fletcher, observing the damage to his flagship from the bridge, made the difficult decision to transfer tactical command to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. This decision reflected the American Navy's emphasis on maintaining command effectiveness even under the most challenging circumstances, ensuring that tactical control remained with officers whose ships retained full operational capability. However, Hiryu was not finished with her attempts to salvage Japanese fortunes in this battle. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, Captain Kaku launched a second strike consisting of 10 Nakajima-K torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway atoll. Despite being wounded in the earlier mission, Tominaga volunteered to lead this crucial attack, knowing that his damaged aircraft likely lacked sufficient fuel for the return journey. As historical records from the Naval War College indicate, this second Japanese attack demonstrated both the courage and the desperation that characterized the Imperial Navy's position by midday on June 4th. The attack succeeded in hitting Yorktown with 2 torpedoes on her port side, causing severe flooding in a dangerous list that threatened to capsize the carrier. The ship's engine stopped, her electrical power failed, and damage control teams worked frantically to prevent her from rolling over and sinking. The sight of Yorktown listing heavily and apparently dead in the water gave Japanese reconnaissance pilots hope that they had achieved a significant victory, possibly sinking an American carrier. However, American damage control proved more effective than Japanese estimates suggested, and the carrier's crew worked miracles to restore partial power and reduce the list to manageable levels. By late afternoon, Hiryu remained the only operational Japanese carrier in the battle area, facing 3 American flat tops whose combined air groups significantly outnumbered her remaining aircraft. The mathematical reality of carrier warfare was becoming apparent without numerical superiority in aircraft. Even the most skilled and courageous pilots could not overcome such overwhelming odds. Captain Kaku prepared his ship for what he suspected would be her final battle, knowing that Hiryu's survival was essential for any hope of Japanese success. In the broader Midway operation, the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Pacific as Admiral Spruance, now commanding the American Carrier Task Force from Enterprise's Flag Bridge, studied intelligence reports about the remaining Japanese carrier. Hiryu's location had been pinpointed by reconnaissance aircraft, and despite the morning's stunning success, Spruance understood that one operational enemy carrier still posed a significant threat to his forces. The Admiral's methodical approach to warfare demanded the complete elimination of Japanese striking power before declaring victory. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Enterprise launched her third strike of the day, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, the same pilot whose persistence in searching for the enemy fleet had led to the morning's devastating attack on 3 Japanese carriers. This strike consisted of 24 Dauntless dive bombers, accompanied by fighters to suppress Japanese air defenses. Every pilot understood the critical importance of neutralizing Hiryu before she could launch additional attacks against the American fleet. Simultaneously, Yorktown's air group, operating from Enterprise and Hornet following their carrier's damage, joined the coordinated assault on the final Japanese flat top. The combined American strike force represented the largest concentration of carrier aircraft deployed in a single attack during the Pacific War to that point, demonstrating how quickly the Americans had learned to mass their available firepower for maximum effect. Aboard Hiryu, Captain Kaku watched the approaching formations of American aircraft with a mixture of admiration and resignation. His remaining fighter cover was pitifully inadequate against such overwhelming numbers, and his flight deck crews were exhausted from the day's continuous operations. The captain ordered his remaining aircraft launched immediately, hoping to inflict some damage on the approaching enemy before his ship succumbed to what appeared inevitable. The American attack on Hiryu commenced at approximately 5:03 in the afternoon, with dive bombers approaching from multiple directions to overwhelm Japanese defensive fire. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey selected the carrier's island structure as his aiming point, while other squadron leaders targeted the flight deck and hangar areas where maximum damage could be inflicted on both the ship and her remaining aircraft. The first bomb struck Hiryu's flight deck forward of the island, penetrating into the hangar deck, where it detonated among parked aircraft and aviation fuel systems. Secondary explosions began almost immediately as the familiar pattern of cascading fires and detonating ordnance transformed another Japanese carrier into a blazing wreck. Unlike the morning attacks, however, Hiryu's damage control teams had prepared for this assault and initially appeared to be containing the fires more effectively. Captain Kaku refused to abandon his ship, instead directing increasingly desperate firefighting efforts as flames spread throughout the carrier's internal spaces. The ship's engineering plant continued functioning despite the topside damage, and for several hours it appeared possible that Hiryu might survive with major repairs. However, the fires eventually reached the aviation fuel storage areas deep within the ship's hull, causing massive explosions that sealed her fate, according to records preserved by the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. Captain Kaku's final radio transmission to Admiral Yamamoto aboard the battleship Yamato was both defiant and tragic. "Hiryu is burning but operational. We'll continue fighting until the end." The captain's dedication to duty exemplified the best traditions of the Imperial Navy, even as those traditions were proving inadequate against American industrial capacity and tactical innovation. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack were either sunk or burning beyond salvage. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu represented the core of Japan's carrier striking force, and their loss in a single day constituted one of the most decisive naval defeats in history. More critically, these ships had carried approximately 300 of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, pilots who had trained for years and participated in every major naval action since Pearl Harbor. The human cost of this defeat extended far beyond the ships themselves. Japanese naval aviation had emphasized quality over quantity, training small numbers of highly skilled pilots rather than establishing the large-scale training programs that characterized American aviation development. The loss of so many experienced aircrew in one day created a gap that Japan's training establishment could never adequately fill, ensuring that even replacement carriers would lack the skilled pilots necessary for effective operations. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4th, Admiral Yamamoto faced the grim reality that his carefully planned operation had resulted in catastrophic defeat rather than decisive victory. The communications room aboard the battleship Yamato had become a chamber of horrors as admiral. Yamamoto received increasingly desperate reports from his scattered fleet commanders. Each radio transmission brought fresh confirmation of the disaster unfolding at Midway, where Japan's most experienced carrier pilots were dying in the oil-slick waters of the Pacific, while their ships burned like funeral pyres against the evening sky. Yamamoto stood motionless at the chart table, his weathered hands gripping the edges as he studied the tactical situation. With the cold calculation that had made him the Imperial Navy's most respected strategic thinker, the mathematics of naval warfare were brutally clear. For carriers sunk or sinking, hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew lost, and the invasion force approaching Midway without adequate air cover. The operation that was supposed to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific had instead crippled Japan's own striking capability. The admiral, who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year before American industrial capacity began to tell, was witnessing the validation of his prophecy. Those 6 months were nearly expired, and instead of delivering a knockout blow to American resistance, Operation Me had handed the enemy their first decisive victory in the Pacific War. Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto's senior staff officer, approached with the latest damage reports from the carrier force. Akagi had been abandoned and was burning beyond control, her magazines threatening to explode at any moment. Kaga had already slipped beneath the waves with most of her crew, while Soryu was listing heavily and would likely sink before dawn. Only Hiryu remained marginally operational, but her fires were spreading and her aircraft capacity was severely reduced. The human cost was equally catastrophic. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was among the wounded evacuated from Akagi. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had planned many of Japan's early victories, had suffered injuries that would keep him from active service for months. The institutional knowledge and combat experience represented by these officers could not be replaced through training programs or promotional ceremonies, as documented in post-war interviews with surviving Japanese naval officers. Yamamoto faced 3 increasingly unpalatable options as darkness fell on June 4th. He could continue the operation with the remaining surface forces, hoping to capture Midway through a night bombardment and amphibious assault without air cover. He could order Admiral Kondo's invasion fleet to withdraw, while attempting to salvage whatever remained of the carrier striking force. Or he could abandon the entire operation and return to Japan with the catastrophic news that the Imperial Navy had suffered its first major defeat of the war. The first option appealed to many of his subordinates, who argued that Japanese superiority in night combat could still achieve victory if the battleships and cruisers pressed home their attack on Midway's installations. The combined fleet possessed overwhelming firepower advantages in surface combat, and a determined night assault might still capture the atoll despite the day's losses. However, Yamamoto understood that such an attack would expose his remaining ships to devastating air attacks from both Midway-based aircraft and the American carriers when dawn arrived. The second option offered the possibility of saving some face while minimizing further losses, but intelligence reports suggested that American submarines were already converging on the area, creating additional threats to his withdrawal route. Moreover, the wounded carriers required destroyer escorts for protection and rescue operations, further reducing the surface forces available for offensive operations. Admiral Yamamoto's decision, reached after consultation with his staff officers, reflected both strategic wisdom and personal anguish. At approximately 9:30 in the evening on June 4th, he ordered the cancellation of Operation Me and the general withdrawal of all Japanese forces from the Midway area. The admiral, who had masterminded Pearl Harbor, was forced to acknowledge that Japan's brief period of naval supremacy in the Pacific had come to an abrupt and devastating end. The withdrawal order, transmitted to fleet commanders throughout the operational area, marked more than just the end of a single battle. It represented the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific that would ultimately end in Tokyo Bay 3 years later. The pre-dawn hours of June 5, 1942, witnessed a transformation in the Pacific War that would resonate through history as one of warfare's most decisive turning points. Admiral Yamamoto's withdrawal order had saved his remaining fleet from further destruction, but the strategic consequences of the Midway defeat would prove far more devastating than the immediate tactical losses suffered during the battle, as Japanese destroyers raced through the darkness to rescue survivors from the burning carriers. The full magnitude of the disaster became apparent to even the most optimistic staff officers. Akagi, the flagship that had led the Pearl Harbor attack, finally exploded in a tremendous fireball that illuminated the entire horizon. Before slipping beneath the Pacific waves, the sight of Japan's premier aircraft carrier disappearing into the depths created a psychological impact among surviving personnel that no amount of propaganda could entirely erase. The statistical reality of Japan's losses at Midway read like a strategic nightmare for Tokyo's war planners. 4 aircraft carriers sunk, 1 heavy cruiser lost, over 300 aircraft destroyed, and approximately 3,000 personnel killed or wounded, including the irreplaceable core of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. In contrast, American losses consisted of 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, approximately 150 aircraft, and 300 personnel casualties. However, the numbers alone failed to capture the true strategic significance of this defeat. Japan's pre-war naval aviation philosophy had emphasized elite training programs that produced small numbers of highly skilled pilots, an approach that worked effectively when pilot losses remained minimal. The Midway catastrophe had eliminated a significant portion of these irreplaceable veterans in a single day, creating a pilot shortage that Japan's training establishment could never adequately address. According to research conducted by the Naval War College, the American approach to pilot training represented a fundamental philosophical difference that would prove decisive in the prolonged Pacific conflict. While Japan struggled to replace experienced aircrew, American training programs were already producing thousands of competent pilots who, while perhaps individually less skilled than their Japanese counterparts, possessed adequate training and increasingly superior equipment. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing intelligence reports from the battle's aftermath, understood that Midway represented more than a tactical victory. It marked the beginning of America's strategic offensive. In the Pacific, the Japanese fleet's withdrawal provided the opportunity to consolidate American positions throughout the Central Pacific while beginning the long advance toward Japan's home islands. The psychological impact of the Midway defeat proved equally significant for both combatants. Japanese confidence in their naval supremacy had been shattered by a battle they had expected to win decisively, while American morale soared following their first major victory against the previously invincible Imperial Navy. The aura of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through 6 months of uninterrupted victories, had been permanently destroyed in the space of a single morning's combat. Emperor Hirohito, receiving news of the defeat in his Tokyo palace, reportedly remained silent for several minutes before asking his naval aide whether Japan could still achieve victory in the Pacific War. The aide's evasive response reflected the growing uncertainty among Japan's military leadership about their nation's ultimate prospects in a prolonged conflict with American industrial capacity. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had shifted permanently to the United States, although the full implications of this transformation would not become apparent for several months. Japanese forces would continue fighting with characteristic courage and tactical skill, achieving local victories and inflicting heavy casualties on advancing American forces. However, the mathematical realities of industrial warfare replacement rates for ships, aircraft, and trained personnel now favored the United States by overwhelming margins. Admiral Yamamoto, returning to Japan aboard the battleship Yamato, spent the voyage composing reports that would attempt to explain how Japan's most carefully planned naval operation had resulted in catastrophic defeat. The admiral, who had warned that Japan must achieve decisive victory within 6 months or face inevitable defeat, had witnessed the validation of his own prophecy at Midway atoll. The Battle of Midway concluded not with dramatic surrender ceremonies or formal declarations, but with the quiet recognition that empires rise and fall based on their ability to adapt, innovate, and sustain prolonged conflict. Japan's failure to achieve decisive victory at Midway ensured that the Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, ultimately ending with American bombers over Tokyo. and foreign warships in Japanese harbors, an outcome that the miscalculations of June 4th, 1942 had made inevitable.